Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Melissa Deckman of PRRI. We are delighted to welcome you today for a conversation about our latest survey that was released today, Immigration Enforcement, ICE, and Civil Liberties in the Second Trump Administration. We're going to let people populate for the webinar, those of you who have signed up. And in the meantime, please, if you get a chance, if you have a question, there's a Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom link. Please post your questions. We'll do our very best to try to get to those questions a little bit later today. Well, it is my pleasure to provide introductions for our distinguished set of panelists today. So joining us today to discuss our survey findings is Jack Jenkins. He is a national reporter for a religious news service based in Washington, covering the intersection of religion and politics as well as U.S. Catholics. He is the author of American Prophets, The Religious Roots of Progressive Politics and the Ongoing Fight for the Soul of the Country. Before joining RNS in 2018, he was a senior religion reporter at the Washington-based Think Progress and holds a Master of Divinity degree from Harvard University. We're also happy to welcome Brian Fraga. He is a staff reporter for the National Catholic Reporter, covering the Catholic Church in the United States. He was previously a contributing editor for our Sunday Visitor, where he also covered news impacting the Catholic Church. He's written for several Catholic publications over the last decade and has won several awards for his news coverage from the Society of Professional Journalists, the New England Newspaper and Press Association, and the Catholic Media Association. We also are happy to welcome Reverend Angela Denker, who is an award-winning author, ELCA Lutheran pastor, and veteran journalist. Her first book, Red State Christians, was the 2019 Silver Forward Indies Award winner for political and social sciences. Her most recent book, Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood, came out last March. About a year ago, today, actually. She is a former columnist for the Minnesota Star Tribune and has written for many publications, including Sports Illustrated, The Washington Post, and Fortune magazine, and has appeared on a number of broadcasts to share her research on politics and Christian nationalism. I'm now going to hand over the program to Robbie Jones. He is the president and founder of PRRI and a New York Times bestselling author. His latest book, Backslide, Reclaiming a Faith and a Nation After the Christian Turn Against Democracy, will be published this September 8th, 2026. He's also the author of The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and The Path to a Shared American Future, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity and the End of White Christian America. And he writes a popular newsletter, Redeeming Democracy, which you all should be following. It features research and analysis on religion, racial justice, and the moral work of democracy. So we're going to begin the webinar with Robbie providing an overview of the findings from our new survey, and then we're going to go to each of our panelists for some of their thoughts and feedback on what we found. Robbie.
Great. Well, thanks, Melissa. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Jack. And thank you, Angela, for all being here. Yeah, we've got a star-studded panel, so we'll have plenty of rich discussion. But my job is to just set the table with an overview of the findings. So I won't be able to cover everything in this little webinar, but we have all of the charts that you would ever want to see, all the breakdowns at our website at prri.org. It's right there on the homepage. You can find it there, so please do make your way over there. You can actually just follow along even while we're talking about it and use it to prime your questions. Just as a reminder, even while we're talking, please do go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A function so that when we turn to that part of the conversation, we'll have plenty of questions to work on. So with that said, I'm going to jump in here and share my screen and walk you through the main findings of the survey that we released today. The topic, one that's just a little bit relevant to today: immigration enforcement, ICE, and civil liberties in the second Trump administration. This is from a very recent survey conducted February 10th to the 18th, just this year. And it is a very large survey. It's nearly 5,500 respondents. So we're the level of the margin of error on this is 1.49 percentage points, plus or minus, at the 95% confidence interval. We also want to thank those who made this survey possible: the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and the Unitarian Universalist Veach program at Shelter Rock. So let's jump in. First, here is a question about how people favor Trump's handling of immigration. In this survey, we also saw that Trump's favorability rating dropped to one of the lowest levels that we've found since tracking Trump's favorability. This number is specifically how he is handling immigration. Comparing this from about a year ago, you could see the drop, and the drop is really among all Americans, but it's also even among Republicans, independents, and Democrats. The one thing to kind of pay attention here, I'm going to point out a couple of gaps as we go. And one of them that we kind of watch in the social sciences is really the gap between independents and the other two self-identified partisan groups. And one of the things that we're seeing increasingly in the data is what social scientists call asymmetric polarization. I'm doing my best to kind of introduce that as the vocabulary word that we see everywhere. So it's asymmetric polarization. What does it mean? It means, yes, that we're polarized, but we're not polarized evenly. Particularly in our partisan divides, it is increasingly independents and Democrats kind of in one place and Republicans in another. If you look here on the most recent data, for example, the percent who favor how Trump is handling immigration, it's only 35% of Americans, but it's 78% of Republicans. And then you could see this just drop off a cliff. It's nearly 50 percentage points between Republicans and independents. And there is this gap between independents and Democrats, but it's much, much smaller. It's more like 25 points. So the gap between Republicans and independents is twice the size as the gap between independents and Democrats. And that's really important to kind of think about where the center is among the public today. There's also a gap. This is not in the chart, but I'm just going to point it out. A similar gap among the religious groups. So, for example, the group that really is the outlier are white evangelical Protestants. They're right there with the Republicans, 74%. Say they have a favorable view of how Trump is handling immigration. And other white Christian groups are higher than most other groups, but it drops pretty quickly. White Catholics are at 53%, and white mainline Protestants are at 44%. But here's one thing to note too. In the religious world, there is a divide really by race and ethnicity. So if you just look inside the Catholic Church, for example, the gap between white Catholics and Hispanic Catholics is also fairly massive. It's 30 percentage points. So on 53% of white Catholics saying they approve of how Trump is, or they favor how Trump is handling immigration versus only 19% of Hispanic Catholics. And similar gap between white evangelical Protestants and Hispanic Protestants there. In fact, that gap is 50 percentage points. Hispanic Protestants only 23% favoring immigration. And we see that gap kind of across a number of measures, but just kind of set the table there. Here is the kind of religious breaks. I gave you some of the more detailed ones, but you can see the break even if we group all white Christian groups together versus all non-white Christian groups, this big gap by race and ethnicity here with a majority of white Christian groups. And again, it's a super majority of white evangelicals at 74% favoring how Trump is handling immigration. But this big gap between Christians of color, non-Christian religious Americans, and unaffiliated, all kind of together down only around a quarter of Americans versus twice as many white Christians in the country. So we also asked questions about just about police officers and ICE officers. This question is favorable views of ICE officers here, and you can again see this asymmetric divide between Republicans on the one hand and Democrats and independents on the other. This has gone down just since we asked about this in the past year. It's now 73% of Democrats versus 6% of 73% of Republicans versus 6% of Democrats, and only 26% of independents saying they hold a favorable view of ICE officers. What's interesting, though, is that this is not just about law enforcement. So we asked a question also about local police officers. And there you can see there's actually majorities of all political parties and persuasions holding favorable views of local police officers, but this very big partisan divide when it comes specifically to ICE officers. So there isn't the big kind of asymmetric polarization happening around. So it's not just a law enforcement thing. It really is specifically about ICE, and we'll see some more of that in the data later on. Also, we found this last year in our American Values Survey that most Americans think that the increased funding to ICE and the big beautiful bill, so-called big beautiful bill, went too far. We're still seeing that in the data today. So only 36% of Americans say they favor the increase in funding to ICE to increase efforts to arrest, detain, and deport undocumented immigrants. But here again is that big asymmetric divide between Republicans on the one hand and independents and Democrats on the other. So we also asked about tactics and specific things. And so we have a panelist with us here today from Minnesota. We asked specifically about whether the surge of ICE officers in places like Minnesota are making communities less safe, whether people agree or disagree with that question. By a margin of 2-1, Americans say yes, they agree that that kind of surge that we saw in Minnesota is making Americans less safe. It is supermajorities of Democrats, 2/3 of independents who agree with that, but only 1/4 of Republicans. And here are the breaks by religion. You can see there's among most religious Americans, there is a kind of consensus that yes, that they made that the surge made Americans less safe. However, we do see here the real group on the end, white evangelical Protestants, only 1 in 3 agreed with that statement. Catholics and non-evangelical white Protestants essentially divided on the question. So really only one group that strongly disagrees with that statement, white evangelical Protestants. And here is a question about whether ICE officers should be able to conceal their identity. This question asks people to agree that they should not be allowed to conceal their identity. Here again, supermajorities of Democrats, 2/3 of independents, only about 3 in 10 Republicans on this question here. So again, that's that same asymmetric divide. This one is specific. We're here have several religion reporters with us today. This one specifically refers to a long-standing policy among both Republican and Democratic presidents that had a policy in place that said that ICE officers should not attempt to arrest people at sensitive locations like schools, hospitals, places of worship. For example, the Trump administration rescinded that order at the very beginning of the administration. And here are the numbers today. It's still a very unpopular. So there's no religious group in the country that favors allowing ICE officers to conduct surveillance and arrests at sensitive locations. The group that's closest are white evangelical Protestants, but even they, who are largely supportive of the Trump administration's immigration efforts, even them, they fall below majority on this policy and mostly disagree that those arrests should be taking place at sensitive locations. So we also asked about whether or not I should be able to arrest and relocate undocumented immigrants, specifically to detention centers in states far from their home. This is a practice that has been implemented in the last year. And here we see again this big divide between Republicans on the one hand, independents and Democrats on the other. Republicans 6 in 10 in favor of allowing ICE officers to arrest and relocate undocumented immigrants, even to detention centers far from their home, and even without allowing them to challenge their detainment here. But this is not a policy that most other Americans, in fact, only 28% of Americans, favor that policy. We've also been asking about a general policy about whether immigrants who are in the country illegally should be detained in internment camps until they should be deported. We've actually seen a slight uptick in support for this question in the general population, and you can see it's kind of across the board. It's only 4 percentage points, but it is a significant uptick since the last time we asked this question. It's now 41%. So most Americans oppose this policy, but it is 4 in 10 Americans who support it. And again, it's Democrats and independents who mostly oppose this policy, but it is 73%, basically 3/4 of Republicans who actually support this policy. And then finally, we asked some questions around the kind of perceptions of immigrants in the country. And one is this thing that's been called the so-called Great Replacement theory. You hear a lot on the far right. It's the idea that immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background. And you'll see here that while it's 2-1, Americans reject that idea. It's only about 1 in 3 Americans that agree with it. We've been asking this question since 2019. Sorry about that. Go back. But it is, in fact, about half of white Christians, and it is a strong majority of white evangelical Protestants who agree with this statement. They are really the group that stands out the most likely to agree with the statement. And you can see this big gap: Christians of color, non-Christian religious Americans, and the unaffiliated, all down around a quarter or less. Agreeing with the statement. So it really is pretty much white Christians, but it's really driven by white evangelical Protestants' views on the statement. One other one is the so-called self-deportation, the idea that the way to fix illegal immigration is to make life so hard for illegal immigrants they decide to go back to their home country by themselves. There is actually not much support for this in the country, and support for this policy has in fact gone down over time. We began asking about this way back in 2013, so we've been asking this more than a decade, and it's now only 1 in 5 Americans who support such a policy, and it even among Republicans, it is less than a majority that support this policy. And then we have a couple of things here. I'll end on where there is a little more support across the board. Still Republicans outliers here, but just a basic question about due process and whether immigrants should have the right to challenge their deportation in court. Again, by margin about 2 to 1, Americans say yes, they should. 6 and 10. It's 88% of Democrats. Again, nearly 2/3 of independents, but only about 1/3 of Republicans who agree with that statement. And then here, a question about really refugee status. And this is one where American policy has changed dramatically in the last year. But the basic idea behind this about whether the U.S. should provide a refuge for people who come to the U.S. if they are in serious danger in their home country. This is a very popular policy and sentiment in the country. It's 72% of Americans. And here we can see kind of across religious groups. It's also across parties. There is strong support for this idea that this is the kind of country people want the U.S. To be. And then we also asked some questions here about concerns about people, kind of freedom, civil liberties in the country. This one is about whether people feel that the ability to criticize the government is a right that seems less protected. We are seeing a move just in the past year, the two parties kind of going opposite ways. Here, we asked this question a year ago. It was 54% of Republicans, as well as 86% of Democrats. So majorities of all parties agreeing that this is something that's less protected in previous years. However, we have seen Republicans really moving away from that idea, now down to only 41%, while independents and Democrats haven't moved that much here, and the general population stayed the same, but the two parties have been moving in opposite directions. So now we have a partisan disagreement about whether civil liberties, like the right to criticize the government, are still something protected. We find very, very strong, though, bipartisan support for opposing the U.S. government being able to collect personal data and build a database of Americans who protest government action. So even 2/3 of Republicans saying that, yes, they oppose the U.S. government taking such actions against people who are protesting the government. So that's, I think, one sign of good news in terms of civil liberties in the country. And then finally, we asked this question about whether people, kind of an extreme measure, whether people would favor stripping U.S. citizens of their citizenship and deporting them if they are determined to be a threat to the country. Again, we asked this last year, again this year. A very little support among Democrats or independents for this, and again 2 to 1 opposition in the country. But we do find a majority, 55% of Republicans, saying that they would favor, stripping even U.S. citizens of citizenship if they're determined to be a threat to the country. However, it has gone down slightly among Republicans over the last year, but still sitting there at 55% at a majority. So I'll wrap it with that and hand it over to our distinguished panelists, where we can kind of talk about these gaps and take the conversation wherever they want to take it. So back to you.
All right. Robbie, thanks so much for that great overview. Again, as Robbie noted, there are more graphs, there's more analysis online. So take a look at our survey report at prrri.org. I want to first turn to Angela Denker for her thoughts and reflections on our survey and just the state of, I think, immigration policies more generally and religion.
Thank you. Yeah, glad to be part of this distinguished group. So before I jump into the rest of my reflections, I just want to say, as I see Robbie go over this data again, the thing that really jumps out at me is when you're seeing these, when we're discussing approval for any of the Trump administration policies, you're seeing this outlier, very, very high, stubborn approval among Republicans for basically anything that is happening in the administration. And what strikes me as I see that number again and again is it starts to look like a party that is really being drawn into authoritarianism, that these are the type of approval numbers that we see in authoritarian regimes. And so that certainly is a red flag that I could not help but ignore when I see again and again these numbers. And related to that, as we're talking about this in the context of religion, for people to have that sort of allegiance to an authoritarian leader requires often a religious alignment as well in a view of God, a theological view of God that aligns with a strong man. So it's certainly aligned with the work I did on masculinity and the work I did on the reshaping of Jesus in my most recent book. So I see that stubbornness continuing, and it is really inseparable from the theological concerns that have become a prominent part of the Republican Party platform. I also want to, so focusing more on immigration specifically, I'm seeing these results through a number of different lenses, but maybe most prominently as a resident of Minneapolis, as a mom who's raising kids here in Minneapolis, as a pastor who's pastoring a congregation in South Minneapolis. And I remember where I was when I heard about the killings of Renee Good and Alex Pretty. And in both of those cases, I heard about it from neighborhood groups and from neighbors before it even hit the news. So one thing I'll say unequivocally is what happened in Minneapolis and what happened in Minnesota with ICE clearly had a strong impact. And so that's one of the first reactions that I have. And I guess I want to say to, the fellow folks here in Minnesota, but also in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in places where ICE has been deployed, who have put their lives and their freedom on the line to go out and document what ICE is doing and the violent tactics they're using, I think it's clear that that has made a difference. And that's an important thing to note as we see these shifts, because when you're on the ground, it's easy to feel the exhaustion and the burnout and the fatigue of, is anything we're doing mattering? And I think it's clear when you see these numbers that that documentation, the videos people took, the pictures, the journalism, and the journalists who documented what's going on, very important. I'll also say this trend we've seen throughout Trump's second term primarily is, but also during the Biden presidency, what we continue to see is that, as I mentioned at the top, there's not a lot of movement with the MAGA base. It is, especially among white evangelicals, white Catholics, there's not a lot of movement there. And I feel like where often the media cycle gets stuck is putting all the energy and attention into that group and the fact that it's immovable. And I think it's more important looking at these numbers to look instead at the movable pieces, to look at where independents are moving, to look at where mainline folks are moving. Um, this drop in white mainline support, specifically for some of these immigration policies, is key. My reaction to that as a mainline pastor who's trying to lift up a gospel that enforces welcoming the stranger and lifts up care for neighbor and love of neighbor. That's important to me as a pastor and as a mom. As a journalist and a researcher, it's also electorally important because the states that swing elections, like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, those are states that have high numbers of white mainliners that are not as prominent in numbers of evangelicals. And so I think it's really important for us to talk about what's going on in the mainline, about the resurgence, which Jack, you've documented in your book, this resurgence of white mainline protest, which we certainly have seen in Minnesota. And the last thing I'll say, that this line that stood out to me in the report: except for white Christian groups, solid majorities across all other religions agree that immigrants should have basic rights. Ooh, as a pastor who has pastors in the whitest denomination in the country, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, I think that is a line that white Christians continue to have to grapple with, because it's a morally damning line. But I think there's also this truth that when white Christians have pushed back against that denial, there has been some movement. I'll pass it along to the next panelist.
I think that's a perfect segue to Jack Jenkins, who's written quite a lot about the progressive left in American politics. I agree, Angela, that some of the most interesting findings are with respect to shifts and attitudes among white mainliners. But I'm not the expert here, Jack is, so I'm going to turn it over to him.
Yeah, I guess you all have called it. One of the numbers that leapt out to me was the particularly dramatic shift among white mainliners in terms of how they felt about Trump's immigration agenda and how he was handling it last year compared to today. And as Angela pointed out, that's particularly important. It's not nothing electorally too. Trump drew upon, and Republicans have drawn upon mainliners, less so than evangelicals, but it's still part of the broader, path to victory in general elections. So it's notable that it's been such a significant drop off over the last year. And for me, what's really interesting is that whether it's correlation or causation, it has tracked with a particularly passionate series of vocal opposition to the president's immigration agenda from mainline leaders in particular. It began his first full day in office in terms of headline grabbing moments like that when the Right Reverend Marion Buddy, the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, preached a sermon to the president while he was in the pews, asking him to have mercy on immigrants. And it basically hasn't let up since, right? Within a few weeks, a multitude of denominations and groups started signing on to lawsuits against the Trump administration dealing with the freezing of the refugee program, as well as the decision to rescind the sensitive locations policy. And I will note as an aside, I do think it's interesting that is popular, that enjoys majority support among zero faith groups, right? Like that was an interesting finding. White evangelicals were the most likely to show support, but nobody had majority support, which is interesting given that it was a decision the administration made very dramatically, despite there being pushback and continued pushback. At my count, there are still 4 lawsuits against that, led primarily by mainline denominations and groups. Then, of course, as the past year escalated, we started seeing mainline pastors prominently featured in terms of protests, right? There was the headline grabbing moment when a Presbyterian pastor was being filmed shot in the head with pepper balls by DHS agents as he stood outside of an ICE facility outside of Chicago. A few weeks later, a Methodist minister was thrown to the ground and arrested while protesting out there. A few weeks after that, a Baptist minister was prominently photographed being thrown to the pavement while protesting again outside of that same facility. One of 7 faith leaders arrested that day. Again, mainline Protestants overrepresented within that group. And then, of course, by the time you got to Minneapolis, when I was there, I was driving around with, UCC pastors, as well as Unitarian Universalists and others who were just a part of that pushback. And for me, one of the more striking moments was when the group in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities called on clergy to come to the city to be trained on how to push back against DHS. And 600 plus clergy flew in less than a week to be a part of that. I've never seen that in my career. I say all that because disproportionately represented in all of that were mainline Protestants. So whether or not these leaders were, this clergy were leading their mainline congregations. And it's worth noting that mainliners are historically, their congregations are more conservative than their clergy, is the truism that often operates in mainline circles. Whether or not these clergy were leading those their congregations into a different direction, or they were moving along with them, it's notable that shift continues to occur. I will also second Angela's noting of the outlier of white evangelicals as well as white Catholics, but I'll leave that to Brian to talk about later. In terms of how disparate, different they are from significant portions of the religious landscape here in the United States. And that I will say that I was also found it interesting the using of Christian nationalism doesn't quite 100% correlate here, because it did seem to correlate, the group that has one of the highest acceptances of adherents and sympathizers with Christian nationalism are white evangelicals, and they were disproportionately supportive of these policies. But behind them is Hispanic Protestants, and the opposite is true in terms of their support for Trump's immigration policies. What seemed more ideologically linked was this support for great replacement theory, which seemed interestingly high among white evangelicals. And so that doesn't entirely surprise me, given what I've seen on the ground from some of these communities. But it is interesting to kind of see that fissure growing. And we're already starting to see interesting levels of tension within Hispanic Protestant, Hispanic evangelical communities, and some white evangelical communities over the issue of immigration. And that's not nothing, given that the Trump administration, or Trump during both of his campaigns, went out of his way to court Hispanic evangelical votes. I mean, when he launched I think his 2020 attempt at reelection, he launched his Evangelicals for Trump initiative in a Spanish-speaking church. So that's not nothing in terms of if he's seen any sort of softening or weakening of support there, if not for Trump himself, then for the Republican Party writ large. I actually have like 17 other things I want to talk about, but I'm going to let the panel continue. So.
Jack, feel free to write those thoughts up in RNS, please, by all means. I want to turn lastly to Brian, certainly not least, really for his take on the survey findings. And I hope too, given his perch at the Catholic Reporter, that he'll really talk really about these interesting Catholic findings that we have in the survey. Brian.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this great panel. Several things jumped out at me from a Catholic angle. The first point being that there's so much political overlap between white evangelicals and white Catholics. For example, I believe white Catholics and white evangelicals were the only religious groups in the survey that expressed favorable views of ICE officers and that supported funding for ICE as well. And that to me speaks to something that I've seen cited in others in other research over the years and in the course of my own reporting, in that Catholics as a whole really tend to take their political cues like from their own personal ideology or from their own news sources, not so much like from what their bishops have to say on these issues. Since like over the last few months or so, we've seen the U.S. Catholic bishops have been increasingly vocal on the topic of immigration. In November, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops released a special message for the first of its kind in more than 12 years or so, in which the bishops expressed their disapproval, their opposition to indiscriminate mass deportations and some of the Trump administration's immigration enforcement policies. And in recent and also in recent weeks, we've seen a growing number of U.S. Catholic bishops speaking out to express their opposition to the administration's policies. We've seen U.S. bishops not only speaking out, but going to Washington, D.C. to lobby for comprehensive immigration reform. But according to the data I see in this report, it seems to me that a lot of what the bishops have been saying about immigration are falling on deaf ears, especially among like the white, more conservative Catholic counterparts in the pews. I mean, almost almost half of white Catholics, according to the survey, believe in the Great Replacement theory, which I found quite notable. Um, and like now, and white conservative, like white Catholics who tend to be more conservative in their theology or politics, on one hand, they will affirm they will not along with what the U.S. Catholic bishops have to say on issues like abortion or transgenderism or LGBTQ rights. They believe in the course of my own reporting, they'll tell me that those are the issues that the bishops should be speaking out on. But when it comes to matters like immigration, we see the white Catholics in the pews um, tend to tune out the bishops, and that's in contrast to to what Hispanic and minority Catholics have to say. There's a wide gap between white Catholics and Hispanic Catholics on a lot of these issues. And something else I found interesting was that like white Catholics in the U.S. They're almost evenly split on whether immigration is a benefit to a society, which I found interesting given that for the most part, white Catholics have like their own families have immigrant backgrounds. So, again, it just speaks to, I believe the polarization in the pews in the church and really the disconnect that bishops have with their flocks in the pews and like how do they bridge that sort of ideological divide is not easy.
Thank you, Brian. Robbie, did you have any reflections on what Brian, Angela, and Jack have shared? Oh, unmute. Thanks.
Man, we think COVID would have cured me of this. 6 years out, and I still can't remember to hit. I was joking about this actually before the seminar that I was going to forget to hit mute. So first of all, thank you, all of you, for your deep insights, and again for your work as journalists and these important days, and for pointing out like I think some of these really important things. I want to just put an asterisk on the white mainline Protestants. Present company excluded, I would say in general, the media has not paid nearly enough attention to the non-evangelical white Protestant world. And for a couple of like practical reasons. Like one is because of all the demographic change in the country today, non-evangelical white Protestants are exactly the same size as white evangelical Protestants are. They're both 13% of the population in our latest data. So that's 13%, each of them. And by the way, white Catholics aren't far off. They're about 13-14% of the population as well, right? So with all the demographic change, it used to be, 30 years ago that white evangelicals by themselves were a quarter of the population, but they're not today. They're 13% of the population. So that means that, and as Angela said, it means that particularly if you're looking at this through the lens of politics, and you're thinking about okay, elections and where do elections get swayed, not only in the midterms but in presidential years, Midwestern states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, like these are states where the non-evangelical white Protestants actually outnumber the white evangelical Protestants, and still they're I think largely ignored. But I do want to just put one thing on this. So in the last presidential election, and actually every time Trump has been on the ballot, the non-evangelical white Protestant world has voted for him by about 6 and 10, right? So they are a Trump-leaning constituency, and so it's important to remember that. But here's the thing: if we go back and we look at the 2024 election, their favorability of Trump was 53% going into the 24 election. It's now 45, right? So just that's not that long ago. So you think about like they were 53 when Trump ran for and asked for their vote. Now it's down to 45. Like that's really important. And then the other group that got mentioned are Latino Protestants, which are also overwhelmingly evangelical. That group also, every time Trump has been on the ballot, voted about 6 and 10 for Trump. Right. So they're, again, another Trump-leaning constituency. They share a kind of evangelical theology, largely with white evangelicals, and I think an affinity for that politics. Again, 2024 election, their favorability of Trump was 51%. So majority 51. This latest data, wait for it, 37. right? So if I'm a Republican operative or the Trump campaign and I'm looking at these numbers, that is should be a wake-up call, right? This group that supported you 6 and 10 had a favorable view of just Trump as a person going into the 24 election. Now that favorability is down to 37%, and a critical growing group of a kind of base constituency. That's really notable. And where you see there, and where it is, I mean, it has been largely around where their support drops is handling of immigration, these surges of ICE. They're not supportive of these things and see those things as a threat to safety of American communities. So just kind of want to throw those two numbers out because as they were all talking, I think it's right. And I guess, Brian, the last thing to say back to you is I'm reminded that H. Richard Niebuhr wrote, actually, it was just almost nearly 100 years ago, a book called The Social Sources of Denominationalism. And there he talked about what a scandal it should be of the way the racial line runs inside the churches. And so it was kind of an indictment to American churches that, we were so divided by lines of race and ethnicity. And we tried to pretend a lot of it was about theology or whatever, but it was largely along lines of race and ethnicity. And when I look at, there's the gaps in the Protestant world between white evangelicals on the one hand and Hispanic Protestants or Black Protestants, it's 50 to 60 percentage points on many of these questions. And then when I look inside the Catholic Church, between white Catholics and Latino Catholics, it's 30, 40 percentage points, right, on these things. And it's just really along the lines of race and ethnicity. So it's a political question, but I think, it also is actually a quite serious theological question is what's happening inside the churches.
Brian, I'm not sure if you wanted to respond. I just wanted to say to that last point about Catholics. We just happened to be pulling some data this morning for another reporter and wanted to know essentially what about religiosity among white Catholics in particular. And we found actually on most measures that it was white Catholics who attended church most frequently that tended to be the most conservative. So I think that's an added wrinkle to all of that, right? Sort of in terms of the role of religiosity here. But certainly, I think, the racial ethnic divide is really profound. So I'm just kind of curious, Brian, maybe your point. A couple of folks have asked in the Q&A about the role of the bishops, but I'm thinking, of course, the role of the first American Pope. I think, the Pope has been pretty outspoken about his displeasure with what's happening with this immigration crackdown. So I'm just kind of, any sense from your reporting, Brian, talking to lay Catholics, do the positions of the leadership really matter? Is there any way that is impacting what's happening with respect to Catholics' views about immigration right now?
From my reporting, the sense I get is that Pope Leo's outspokenness on behalf of migrants, that it has emboldened certain U.S. Catholic bishops to speak out. This past fall, Pope Leo met with El Paso Bishop Mark Seitz, and the Pope made the point that the U.S. bishops that they needed to speak with one voice on the issue. And from speaking with several U.S. Catholic bishops, I get the impression that they take that they really took that to heart, that they're really taking the Pope seriously, and trying to speak out and to kind of align themselves with the plight of the migrants and their humanity, and and their calls for a more humane immigration enforcement regime. But whether how much of that is actually trickling down to the pews, that's a little more difficult to tell, to discern, only because every time I write immigration stories, the feedback I get from the readership tends to be very polarized among our Catholic readers. There's a significant portion of the Catholic electorate in the U.S. who really, they have hardline views on immigration, and there's really doesn't seem to be much either Pope Leo or any particular U.S. Catholic bishop can say to to just to break through like that polarization. So yeah, so I guess the short answer I suppose is like, at the level of the pews and the laity, I don't know how much impact the Pope and the bishops are actually having.
I'd love to jump in, just share a little something here too. I come from a half Catholic background, so I grew up a little bit in the Catholic Church, but also in recent years have covered the TRADS, the Traditionalist Catholic Movement for U.S. Catholic Magazine, and in my first book. And one of the elements I think we're seeing, especially among younger Catholics, is and Catholic converts, what they're being drawn to, and this is really gendered, it tends to be among young men. What they're drawn to within the Catholic Church is the hierarchy. So we're even seeing folks leaving places like the Southern Baptist Convention and moving into either Catholicism or, traditional conservative Anglicanism because they're drawn to the hierarchy. So I think that the overarching explanation there is much more one of being drawn to an authoritarian framework, which can, of course, be found within the Catholic Church. But the rub there is that Catholicism, of course, is a global movement by necessity. It cannot be nationalist in that sense. And I looked up closely. I was curious. And Brian, maybe you have better data on this. It looks like it's maybe around 30% of Catholics worldwide who are white. So in the US, this movement seems like it's also drawn by a reactionary sense of losing global power and influence, maybe even within the church, and maybe, connected to Pope Francis' tenure as well.
Jack, I don't know if you wanted to kind of chime in here, maybe what some of the reporting you've done at RNS about the role of the Catholic Church in shaping Americans' attitudes, especially Catholics' attitudes on immigration.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's been an interesting series of efforts recently, right after Trump was elected. It was notable that the USCCB and national, I don't remember which evangelical organizations, but I believe some prominent evangelical organizations all together produced a report about who was most at risk, that Christians were at risk of deportation under Trump's new policies. And that was an interesting effort to me because it was them being willing to say, look, like from our perspective, and they noted in the report that this was specifically true, and particularly true for Catholics in the United States, but wanting to kind of signal to conservative Christians across the board, hey, like this is something we're concerned about as religious professionals, both as evangelicals and Catholics. And so, and it's also notable to things that Brian has noted, and Angela as well, like the bishops have spoken out. They produce like glossy videos about this, which is new for them to do for this kind of thing. And the fact that there seems to be a media strategy at all is kind of an interesting thing to observe. And from where I sit, it's often been interesting as a reporter to see how rare it is for bishops to participate in demonstrations, right? How unusual that is. And the fact that I have seen a little bit of that in the last year, particularly with regard to allowing for access of pastoral care for immigrants who are being detained in ICE detention. The fact that we had an auxiliary bishop in Chicago who was part of one of those demonstrations, like that spoke volumes to me. Because one, that was something that the Pope had brought up himself, right? That specific issue. But two, like I think that is kind of an interesting way of saying, look, like when your bishop's willing to go out there and maybe not throw themselves in in front of police and get arrested, but maybe, physically put themselves on TV saying these kinds of things to get attention. The fact that they are part of lawsuits. The USCCB has sued the Trump administration. Like that is notable from the perspective of a reporter, knowing that they have invested so much energy in other issues, for instance, pushing back against abortion. Now, Catholic bishops have pushed back against abortion for a long time and not necessarily won over Catholics writ large across the country. So the effectiveness of this sort of activism remains an open question. But for me to see bishops kind of put themselves more out there and more on the line for this signals that they at least, several of them do at least believe that they can impact their congregants if the effort is expended.
Robbie, I want to throw a question back to you. We've had a couple of people talk about evangelicals and Republicans writ large. I know that the National Association of Evangelicals has actually been outspoken about policies that their disapproval of these very harsh policies. But in your mind, what will it take to change white evangelical Protestants' attitudes about immigration, or is it just something that is probably not likely?
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, here's the thing to say is that white evangelicals didn't vote 100% for Donald Trump. It's worth remembering that, right? There's a good 15% that every election, will not vote for Donald Trump. So that's worth, noting. I think sometimes people forget, like, and just pretend it's 100%. That's not true. There is a voice kind of on the other side in dissenting here. I mean, there was, I think particularly, there was less so in this last election, but certainly in Trump's first election, a robust debate inside the evangelical church about whether support for Trump was something legitimate to do from a religious standpoint. That happened less in this last election, but did happen before. I will point out that Galen Carey, I think, is on the call here and posted the NAE and USS Council of Bishops thing that Jack mentioned. So I just want to make sure that's there. And thank you for that, Galen. And for the work there. It's really important. But by and large, what we see is that among white evangelicals who are supportive of Donald Trump, we're seeing very little breaking of ranks so far. So there's some diminishment on some of these measures, but we're still seeing very, very high favorability, very, very high support for the policy. So in the same report, for example, we asked a general favorability of Donald Trump. And in this overall in Americans, it was 36% favored Donald Trump. Among white evangelical Protestants, it was 69%. And that's really where it's been. We've been tracking Trump's favorability actually since before he was president in 2015. And it's notable that before he received the Republican nomination, his favorability among white evangelicals was 48%. But as soon as he received the nomination for president and kind of get the campaign underway, going into the election, it reached 61% very, very quickly, almost overnight. And then once he became president, it has been around 7 and 10. It is very, very, like only on a couple of occasions has it dropped below 60%. And then it kind of pops right back up, and it's around 7 and 10 today. So I would say so far, we haven't seen it, and I would say that the tragic thing from my point of view is that it is much of this is bound up with this idea of the Great Replacement theory that there are real Americans here, and this idea that we're a Christian nation, and in fact we're a white Christian nation, and people who don't fit that mold are quote unquote invading the country. We're hearing that language, and it's actually resonating among white evangelical Protestants. I think we can measure its resonance, and that is part of the glue that is kind of bound white evangelicals to Trump.
I would add to, we have a good question here. Someone asked, in your surveys, have you asked what shapes people's views, clergy, bishops, Bible studies, personal experience, news, social media? And they write also that they're aware how social media has micro-targeted regions over the past decade. So in our analysis, we do regularly look at how sources of news and what are your most trusted sources are influencing your attitudes. And we tend to find that Americans who mostly follow Fox News or more conservative sites tend to be the most likely to identify, or we tend to identify them as Christian nationalists holding those views. And so I think there's definitely a relationship between the media diets that people are consuming and their views on these sorts of things. I think oftentimes, religion really matters, right? Even if you go to church weekly, or if you're a Baptist who went on Wednesday nights, twice on Sundays, you also have to compete in an environment where online and on TV, people are watching lots and lots of content that reinforces some of those views as well. And so I think it's a really important point to kind of bear in mind here. We have about 7 minutes left, and so I wanted to give folks in our panel maybe a chance to share some final thoughts, but also there's been a lot of questions with respect to how do we actually move the needle? Like how can religious communities, in fact, continue to raise awareness about these policies and maybe what impact they might have in the fall? And I realized too, this survey was in the field right before the war with Iran happened, and so I think there's always sort of the danger that this kind of issue, which has resonated, I think, with many Americans, and it's very unpopular with many Americans, might be taking a back seat. And I don't think there's evidence that there's an abatement of a lot of these harsh immigration tactics. But anyway, I'm going on too long. So I want to hear from the panelists, maybe Angela, Jack, and Brian, about some final thoughts and maybe how all of this might relate to the midterms this fall. Angela, I'll start with you.
Okay. Yeah, I think what stands out to me, and especially with my experience here in Minnesota, is when people are feeling that sense of powerlessness, that sense of overwhelming, which is part of the strategies of authoritarianism. Famously, Steve Bannon says we're going to flood the zone, and the zone is always flooded. And what was coming to my mind as well when Melissa was speaking is the consolidation of media. And so certainly we've dealt with Fox News. We know Fox News. When I started journalism school at the University of Missouri back in 2003, we watched a documentary called Outfoxed, and they said, wow, conservative media is really doubling down. Now, Fox is sort of the tip of the spear. You have CBS News that's being run by someone who has promised to ideologically drag it further towards the right or towards the quote unquote center. You have the homogenization of most of our networks who are providing news, and it becomes more and more difficult for regular journalists, as I know Jack and Brian know, to sustain financially an independent news reporting organization, which is why groups like PRRI, who are continuing to provide data to journalists, are so important. But just for folks to be aware that you start to feel like you're sounding a little bit conspiratorial when I'm about to say that if we look towards the information that people are getting, it really all goes back to the enrichment of billionaires. And so when people are getting their news from social media networks, whatever serves the consolidation of wealth among fewer and fewer individuals, you can kind of trace that back to a lot of the policies that are being backed right now. And they're being clothed in many cases with clothing of white nationalism, which has become an increasingly important part of the Republican platform. And so I think the challenge is, my husband was telling me yesterday, oh, it sounds like Trump is going to listen to his chief of staff. Maybe they're going to back off on some of the ICE tactics. And I said, what's really challenging about that is the reason that much of the base is there now, and we're seeing this with the news stories coming out about young Republican groups at campuses across the country, the use of anti-Semitic language, the use of certainly dehumanization of women, and the sanctioning of abuse of women and girls. It's become such an inseparable part of the platform, as Robbie notes with the great replacement theory, that when you try to back away from it, all of a sudden it's become such a central part of the brand. And people like J.D. Vance and Stephen Miller have certainly tied themselves to that part of the brand. So that's really the challenge when you talk about backing away, and that's why people feel overwhelmed. But I would just urge people to look to their local communities, get to know your neighbors, get to find out people's stories around you. And then when, God forbid, your community is in a situation where you need one another, you'll already know your neighbors. And those networks are going to be really important for caring for one another. I'll pass it along.
Thank you. Jack,
Yeah, just real briefly. One, Robbie, you'll be happy to know that that 13% number actually landed in the third paragraph of my piece that I published a few minutes ago. So, but in addition to that, as a reporter, I don't advise activist groups or anything like that. But what I have been struck by is how heavily the activism around pushback to DHS, including faith-led versions, has landed. And I mean, just as like a top-down view, the fact that the Trump administration, if the fact that they were changing leadership of DHS and at least rhetorically pushing towards different kinds of postures, even if that doesn't necessarily change actions on the ground, that is not something that doesn't happen very often under the Trump administration. And I don't think activists would necessarily consider anything a win per se, because a lot of the faith-led activists who are pushing back against DHS that I speak to would prefer that that all of the deportations stop, as it were, et cetera, et cetera. But it is fascinating how much of an impact this collective effort has made. I don't know what that looks like going forward, particularly if the administration changes, how they are operating with regard to pursuing the president's mass deportation agenda. But it is an interesting thing for me as someone who covers activism a lot on both the right and the left, how heavily the faith-led pushback to DHS has landed with the general public, how much attention it has gotten, and how much it has galvanized so many different people. So I think it's taken many different forms throughout that time period. But as someone who covers a lot of protests that nobody pays attention to, it's really fascinating to see so much drawn toward what has happened in the last few months in Minneapolis and elsewhere.
Thank you. And Brian, finally, your final thoughts.
Sure. Just a couple final thoughts. Someone made a great point in the Q&A about wondering how much of the bishops' pro-immigration stances are filtering down to at the parish level into the pews, especially noting that a lot of the priests, especially a lot of the younger ordained priests, various surveys show they tend to be like rather conservative in their political views. So it's fair to ask how much of what the bishops are saying is filtering down through the pastors and the priests to the people in the pews, especially the older white Catholics who may not be on social media, who may not otherwise really be too much aware of what the bishops are saying on immigration. And also, I think the point was made by a couple of the panelists regarding sort of like a reactionary impulse that we see in some of these religious demographics. And I think that we are seeing that among white Catholics. For example, almost half, like 4 in 10 white Catholics actually support allowing ICE to detain and relocate migrants without due process. Like 4 in 10 Catholics believe that. And white Catholics are also among the only religious groups in which a majority support detaining migrants in internment camps. So that's another challenge for bishops to have to contend with. Perhaps the slide toward authoritarianism in some of these demographics, and what does that mean for the long-term health of these churches?
Thank you, Brian. Robbie, any final thoughts before we end today?
Just again, thank you for our panelists, for everybody who's joining us today. And to say that we're going to have this period between Juneteenth, July 4th, and the midterm elections, where we're going to be having this big debate about what kind of a country do we want to be, who is a real American, all those kind of questions that with this survey is measuring is going to be right in front of us. So kind of take these things into that debate. So again, thank everybody for joining today.
Yeah, thank you for all your wonderful insights into our survey. Please follow their work if you're not doing so already. Take a look at our work as well. We are on social media at Blue Sky, LinkedIn, Facebook, and on YouTube. So please take a look at what we do. And if you feel so inclined, support our work as well as a nonprofit. I appreciate, Angela, the shout out that our goal is to really provide good quality, gold standard data to inform public conversation. So please check us out. Thank you all and have a good rest of your day.